My mentor died on a Tuesday, and by Friday, my brother had already changed the locks on the house my mentor left behind. I know how that sounds. I know you're probably already forming opinions about my brother, about me, about what kind of family does something like that. But before you decide, let me tell you the whole story. Because the part that wrecked me wasn't the locks. It was the smile on his face when he handed me a trash bag and told me to collect my things from the porch. His name was Dale. My brother, 38 years old, never held a job longer than 14 months, always had a reason why nothing was ever his fault. Our father left when we were kids. Our mother worked double shifts at a diner until her knees gave out. I watched her do that for years, and I promised myself I would build something real, something that would mean she'd never have to stand on those feet again. The man who helped me do that was Frank Calloway. Frank wasn't family by blood. He was my mother's neighbor. He moved in next door when I was 19, fresh out of a community college program with a certificate in electrical work and exactly 0 clients. Frank was 61 at the time, a retired contractor who'd built half the commercial properties in our county before his wife passed. He had a workshop in his garage, a standing offer for coffee every morning, and a patience with young men that I later understood was rare. He taught me how to read blueprints, how to bid a job without undercutting myself into bankruptcy, how to talk to a client who was scared of the cost and help them see the value. He co-signed my first business loan when every bank in town had already told me no. He showed up on my first big job site at 6 in the morning with 2 thermoses and a level just because he wanted to see me get it right. I worked for 7 years after that. Not comfortably, not easily. My business grew the way real things grow. Slowly, sometimes painfully, with setbacks that felt like they might end everything. I hired my first employee at year 3, my 5th at year 5. By the time I was 31, I had a crew of 11 people, a solid reputation in the region, and a mother who no longer had to work double shifts. Frank watched all of it. He never took credit. He never asked for anything back. When I tried to pay him for the cosign, he waved it off. When I offered to take him to dinner to celebrate my first 6-figure contract, he said, "Just don't forget what it felt like to need someone." I never forgot. What I didn't know for all those years was what Frank had quietly been building on his end. He never talked about money. That wasn't unusual. His generation didn't. He lived simply, drove a truck that was older than my business, wore the same canvas jacket from October through March. The house next door to my mother's was modest. 3 bedrooms, a good yard, that workshop I practically grew up in. When Frank got sick, I was the one who drove him to his appointments. My brother knew about the illness. I called him twice the week Frank was diagnosed with a cardiac issue. Dale said he'd try to come by. He came by once, stayed 40 minutes, and spent most of it asking Frank if he needed any help, getting his affairs in order. I remember the way Frank looked at me after Dale left. He didn't say anything. He just picked up his coffee cup. For the next 14 months, I rearranged my work schedule around Frank's needs. I wasn't the only one helping. My mother cooked for him 3 times a week, and a home health aide named Rosaria came on weekday mornings. But I handled the driving, the pharmacy runs, the contractor decisions when his roof needed patching, the calls with his doctor when Frank couldn't always follow the medical language. It wasn't a burden. It was the least I could do. Frank passed on a Tuesday in March, quietly at home the way he'd wanted. I didn't cry at the service. I think I was still waiting for it to feel real. I sat in the 3rd row of a small funeral home chapel with my mother on one side and Rosaria on the other, and I listened to 3 people give eulogies about a man who had quietly shaped more lives than any of them probably knew. Dale sat in the back. He came in 4 minutes after the service started and left during the final prayer. I saw him on the way out, standing near his car in the parking lot, scrolling his phone. He looked up and said, "Rough loss, man." Like Frank was an acquaintance. Like Frank had been anyone's to lose casually. I should have paid more attention to why Dale had come at all. Frank's attorney was a woman named Patricia Hendricks. She'd been handling his estate documents for years, apparently. She called me the following Monday and asked me to come in on Wednesday for the reading of the will. I assumed it was a formality. Maybe Frank had left me some tools from the workshop or a piece of equipment. That was the scale I was imagining. Dale called me Tuesday night. "Hey," he said. "Patricia Hendricks reached out to me too." "Okay," I said. "I just want you to know, whatever's in there, I think we should be mature about it. family first. I remember thinking that was an odd thing to say. Dale and Frank had barely known each other. There was nothing to be mature about. I told him I'd see him there and hung up. Wednesday morning, Patricia Hendricks' office was downtown, second floor of a building that used to be a bank. Tall ceilings, the kind of office that makes everything feel official. Dale was already there when I arrived, sitting with his legs crossed and his phone face down on his knee, trying to look casual in the way people do when they are absolutely not casual. Patricia was direct. She didn't preamble much. She explained that Frank had updated his documents 18 months before he passed, roughly 2 months after his diagnosis, and that the estate was more substantial than most people had realized. More substantial. The workshop property next to my mother's house was valued at around $340,000 with the land. Frank also had investment accounts, conservative ones, built over 40 years of careful saving, totaling just under $1.1 million. There was a small commercial property on the edge of town he'd never mentioned to anyone, currently leased to a plumbing supply company, valued at around $280,000. I sat there doing math I hadn't prepared to do. Patricia looked at both of us and read the document. Frank had left Dale $15,000, specifically designated, in the document's language, to give my neighbor's son, Dale Mercer, every opportunity to make a better choice than he has made so far. He left me everything else. Dale's face didn't go pale. It went completely, utterly still, the kind of still that happens before something loud. "That's not right," he said. Patricia didn't flinch. "The document is valid. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized." "He barely knew me," Dale said, and I think he meant it as an argument for why the split was unfair. But it landed differently. It landed like a confession. "He knew you well enough," Patricia said, and she moved on. I don't remember driving home. I remember sitting in my truck in the parking garage for a while, just staring at the concrete wall in front of me. I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about a morning about 4 years earlier when Frank had said to me, "The people who show up when it costs them something, those are the ones you hold on to." He'd been talking about hiring practices, or maybe he hadn't been. Dale called me 6 times before I got home. I didn't answer. He came to my apartment that evening. I let him in because I didn't want to have the conversation in the hallway. He walked in like he'd been wronged in a way that deserved acknowledgement, which was a posture I recognized from our childhood. He used it whenever something hadn't gone his way, and he needed someone else to agree that the world was unfair. "You influenced him," Dale said. "You were around him constantly. You had opportunities to." "To what?" I asked. He stopped. "Say it," I said. "Finish the sentence." He couldn't finish it, because the sentence ended with "to earn it," and Dale knew, somewhere under the resentment, that he had never tried. "He was like a father to me," I said. "Not because I asked him to be. Because I showed up. Every appointment. Every bad day. Every time he needed someone to drive him at 6 in the morning or wait with him for 3 hours in a waiting room. I was there, not because I thought there was anything in it for me. Because he mattered." Dale left. He didn't slam the door, which surprised me. He just left. For about 3 weeks, things were quiet. I started working with Patricia on the estate transition. I walked through Frank's workshop and let myself feel it. The smell of sawdust and machine oil, the pegboard wall where he kept every tool in exactly its outline. I sat in his chair at his workbench and understood, fully for the first time, that he was gone. I started thinking about what to do with it all. Not the money. The responsibility of it. Frank hadn't given me a windfall. He'd given me a test. The first thing I did was set up an account in my mother's name that would cover her living expenses fully for the rest of her life. She cried when I told her. I told her Frank had made it possible, and she should thank him instead. She said she'd been thanking him for years in her own way. The second thing I did was call my best employee, a guy named Marcus who'd been with me since year 2 and had been carrying work that deserved a partner's title, not a foreman's. I told him I wanted to make him a co-owner of the business. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Frank Calloway, right? That's where this came from." Marcus had met Frank once at a job site. One conversation, and he'd understood immediately who Frank was. The third thing I did was call Patricia and ask about the $15,000 Dale had inherited. She confirmed he'd received it. I didn't ask anything else. What I heard next came from my mother. Dale had called her. He'd told her that I had manipulated a dying old man, that I'd isolated Frank from other people, that I'd manufactured a closeness that wasn't real. My mother, to her enormous credit, told Dale that she had watched the relationship between me and Frank for over a decade, and that if he was going to say those things, he needed to say them to her face with evidence, not over the phone where he could hang up when it got hard. He hung up, then something unexpected happened. About 6 weeks after the reading of the will, Dale filed a formal challenge to the estate. He hired an attorney with a reputation for contesting inheritances and submitted a claim that Frank had lacked full mental capacity when he updated his documents, pointing to the fact that the update had happened after the cardiac diagnosis. I called Patricia immediately. She was not concerned. Frank was meticulous, she told me. When he updated his documents, he requested that his cardiologist provide a written statement regarding his cognitive clarity. It's already in the file. Your brother's attorney will find it when they do discovery. He planned for this, I said. Frank planned for everything, Patricia said. That was who he was. The challenge was dropped 11 weeks later. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call Dale. I didn't post anything or tell anyone in a way that was meant to feel like winning. I sat in my truck outside the workshop on a Thursday afternoon, and I thought about what Frank would have done with a moment like this. He would have gone back to work. So I did. The commercial property on the edge of town, the one leased to the plumbing supply company. I kept the lease running for the income, but I started thinking about what it could become eventually. Frank had a vision for that property, Patricia told me. He'd mentioned it once in a meeting years ago. He wanted it to become a trade training space, somewhere young people who couldn't afford a 4-year degree could learn real skills and get paid while doing it. I started looking into what it would take to make that happen. Dale reached out one more time. Not by phone. He sent a letter, handwritten, which surprised me. It was 4 paragraphs. The first 2 were still defensive explanations for why he'd felt justified in the legal challenge, reasons why the situation had felt unfair from where he stood. But the 3rd paragraph was something different. He wrote that he'd been thinking about the last time he'd seen Frank alive. The 40-minute visit. He wrote, I kept waiting for a moment that felt right to really talk to him. I kept thinking I had more time. The 4th paragraph was 1 sentence. It said, I think I've known for a long time that I've been waiting for the right moment to show up, and the right moment keeps not coming because I keep not making it come. I read that paragraph 4 times. I didn't write back immediately. I waited 2 weeks because I wanted to respond from a settled place rather than a reactive one. When I did write back, I said that I'd received his letter and that I believed he meant what he said in that last paragraph. I said I wasn't in a position to pretend the legal challenge hadn't happened because it had. But I said that Frank had believed people could change when they decided to, and I wasn't going to be the person who refused to leave a door open. I said if he ever wanted to come see the workshop, he was welcome to. He hasn't come yet. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. That's not something I can control, and I've stopped trying to account for it in my plans. What I can tell you is this. Frank Calloway was not a wealthy man in the way people mean when they say that. He was wealthy in the way that matters more and lasts longer. He was wealthy in the hours he gave and the patience he held, and the quiet, consistent belief that the people around him were capable of more than they were currently doing. He turned that belief into action every single day, and the money was just the physical residue of a life lived with that kind of discipline. I think about him most mornings when I pull up to a job site and my crew is already there. When Marcus makes a call that I would have made the same way. When my mother sends me a text from somewhere she went for the first time because she no longer has to worry about whether she can afford it. The workshop is still there. I haven't changed anything inside it. The tools are still on the pegboard in their outlines. The workbench still smells like him. I go in sometimes on Sundays when the week has been hard, and I sit in that chair and I think about a 19-year-old kid with a community college certificate and no clients who is offered a cup of coffee by a man who didn't have to offer him anything. And I think about all the ways I am still, every day, trying to be worth that cup of coffee. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why Frank never told me what he was planning. He had years to mention it. Dozens of mornings at that workbench where he could have said something. He never did. And the longer I sit with that, the more I understand it wasn't an oversight. It was the whole point. If I had known, everything I did would have been shadowed by it. Every pharmacy run, every waiting room hour, every early morning drive, all of it would have carried the weight of expectation. Frank understood something that most people don't learn until it's too late. The truest version of who you are only shows up when there's nothing in it for you. He needed to see that version of me, so he stayed quiet and he watched. Dale made the opposite choice, and I don't think he even realized he was making it. He wasn't cruel by design. He was just someone who had spent so long waiting for the right conditions to show up, that showing up had become something he always planned to do later. Later, when things settled. Later, when it was more convenient. Later, when the moment felt right. And the tragedy of that kind of waiting is that later has a way of becoming never, and never has a way of becoming a 40-minute visit and a question about affairs being in order. What I keep coming back to is this. Character isn't built in the dramatic moments. It's built in the ordinary ones. It's built in whether you answer the phone on a Tuesday when someone needs a ride. It's built in whether you sit in a waiting room for 3 hours without being asked to. It's built in whether you show up when there's no audience and no reward and nothing to gain except the knowledge that you did the right thing. Frank left me money, yes. But what he actually left me was a mirror. The estate was just the reflection of a decade of choices, compounded. The investments he'd made in me when I was 19 came back as trust. The hours I gave him when he was sick came back as responsibility. Nothing appeared from nowhere. Every line in that document traced back to something real that one of us had done or chosen or refused to do. I think about Dale's letter sometimes. That last paragraph. The one where he finally said out loud what I think he'd known for years. There's something quietly devastating about a person recognizing their own pattern at the exact moment the consequences of that pattern have already landed. But there's also something that looks, if you tilt your head right, like the beginning of something better. People do change. Not because the world forces them to. Because they finally get honest with themselves about what they've been choosing. I'm not waiting for Dale to walk through the door of the workshop. I'm not building my life around whether he does. What I'm doing is trying to be the kind of person that Frank saw in me before I fully saw it in myself. Someone who shows up, does the work, takes care of the people in his life, and trusts that none of it is wasted. That's not a strategy. That's not a formula for getting something back. That's just the only way I know how to honor a man who gave me a cup of coffee on a morning when he didn't have to give me anything at all.